The scorching sun hung mercilessly in the clear blue sky as Catherine Turner rode her chestnut mare across the arid landscape of Northern California, far from the relative safety of Concord. The year was 1875, and the 24-year-old schoolteacher had made what was now clearly a foolish decision to take a shortcut through the hills on her way to visit her sister in Sacramento. Catherine wiped the sweat from her brow, her dark blonde hair sticking to her neck despite being pinned up beneath her wide-brimmed hat. She'd been riding for hours, and her water supply was dangerously low. The terrain was rougher than she remembered, scattered with rocks and scrubby vegetation. Her mare, Penny, trudged forward loyally, but even the horse seemed weary in the relentless heat. "Just a little further, girl," Catherine murmured, patting Penny's neck. "We'll find some shade and rest soon." As they rounded a large boulder, Catherine spotted a small grove of trees beside a dry creek bed. Relief flooded through her. She guided Penny toward the promised shade, already imagining the cool respite it would offer. As they approached, Catherine dismounted, her legs stiff from the long ride. She led Penny to the trees, tying her reins loosely to a branch. Catherine stretched her arms above her head, working out the kinks in her back. She reached for her canteen, taking a small sip of the tepid water. She would need to find a water source soon. The maps she'd studied suggested there should be a creek nearby, though it might be reduced to little more than a trickle in the summer heat. She was just replacing the canteen in her saddlebag when she heard a low, distinctive rattle that made her blood run cold. Catherine froze, her heart hammering in her chest. Slowly, she turned her head to locate the source of the sound. There, not 3 feet away, was a large rattlesnake, its brown and tan diamond pattern unmistakable against the dusty ground. Its tail vibrated in warning, its head raised and ready to strike. "Easy now," she whispered, more to herself than to the snake. She began to back away slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements, but her foot caught on a rock, sending her stumbling backward. The snake struck with lightning speed. Catherine screamed as she felt the sharp fangs sink into her calf. Penny whinnied in fear, pulling at her reins. The snake retreated, slithering away into the underbrush as quickly as it had appeared. Pain radiated up Catherine's leg. She collapsed onto the ground, her hands shaking as she reached for her calf. 2 small puncture wounds were clearly visible, blood already beginning to ooze from them. Fear gripped her as the reality of the situation set in. She was miles from any town or settlement alone and had just been bitten by a rattlesnake. "Help!" she cried out, though she knew it was futile. There was no one around to hear her. She tried to remember what she'd heard about snake bites. She needed to stay calm, keep the wound below her heart, and try to extract the venom. But how? And even if she managed that without proper medical attention, her chances were slim. Catherine felt tears welling in her eyes. She'd always been independent, stubborn even. It was why she'd insisted on making this journey alone, despite her father's objections. Now, that stubbornness might cost her her life. The sound of hoofbeats in the distance made her head snap up. Was she hallucinating already? No, there it was again, growing louder. Someone was approaching. "Help over here," she called, her voice cracking. A moment later, a rider appeared, mounted on a tall black stallion. He wore a weathered cowboy hat pulled low over his eyes, a faded blue shirt, and dusty jeans. As he drew closer, Catherine could see he was young, perhaps in his late 20s, with sun-bronzed skin and a square jaw covered in a few days' worth of stubble. He pulled his horse to a stop when he spotted her on the ground. "Madam, you all right?" He called, his voice deep and tinged with concern. "Snake," Catherine managed to say, pointing to her leg. "Rattlesnake bite." The man dismounted in one fluid motion, tying his horse quickly before rushing to her side. He knelt beside her, his expression grim as he examined the wound. "How long ago?" he asked, his voice calm despite the urgency of the situation. "Just now." "Just a minute ago," she replied, fighting to keep her voice steady. He nodded, his blue eyes meeting hers. "I'm Thomas Vance. I'm going to help you, but I need to act fast." Without waiting for a response, he pulled a knife from his belt. Catherine's eyes widened in alarm. "What are you? Need to cut it open a bit, make it bleed more," he explained quickly. "Then I need to suck out the venom. It's the only way." Before Catherine could protest, he made 2 quick, shallow cuts across the fang marks. She gasped at the sharp pain but bit her lip to keep from crying out. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice gentler now. "This is going to hurt, but it might save your life." Thomas bent his head and placed his mouth over the wound. Catherine felt the strange sensation of his lips on her skin, then the pull as he sucked at the wound. He turned his head to spit out the blood and venom, then returned to the task. He repeated this process several times, each time spitting the contents of his mouth onto the ground beside them. After what seemed like an eternity, he finally sat back on his heels, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "That should help," he said, pulling a bandana from his pocket. He tied it tightly around her calf, just above the bite. "Not too tight, we don't want to cut off circulation completely, just slow the spread of any remaining venom." Catherine stared at him, a mixture of gratitude and disbelief washing over her. "Thank you," she whispered. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't come along." Thomas offered a small smile. "Just lucky timing, I guess. I was heading back to my camp when I heard you call out." He reached for his canteen. "Here, drink some water, you need to stay hydrated." She accepted the canteen with shaking hands, taking a long drink of the cool water. "I'm Catherine Turner. Nice to meet you, Miss Turner, though I wish it were under better circumstances." He glanced around. "We need to get you someplace safe where you can rest." "My camp's not far from here." "Camp? You don't live in town?" Thomas shook his head. "I'm a surveyor for the railroad. Been camping out here for the past few weeks, mapping the terrain." He looked at her leg again. "The venom's still in your system. You're going to feel sick soon, and you won't be able to ride on your own." As if on cue, Catherine felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. The world seemed to tilt sideways, and she swayed where she sat. Thomas caught her before she could fall. "Whoa there, I've got you." With surprising gentleness for a man his size, he lifted her into his arms. "I'm going to put you on my horse. He's steadier than your mare." Catherine couldn't find the energy to protest. Her leg was throbbing and the dizziness was getting worse. She felt Thomas lift her onto his stallion, then mount up behind her. His arms encircled her as he reached for the reins, his chest solid and warm against her back. "I'll lead your horse," he said, his breath tickling her ear. "Just lean back against me. I won't let you fall." Catherine did as he instructed, too weak to do otherwise. As they set off, the rocking motion of the horse made her stomach lurch, but Thomas's strong arms kept her secure. She closed her eyes, trying to focus on anything other than the pain and nausea. "Stay with me, Catherine," Thomas murmured. "Talk to me. Where are you from?" Concord, she managed to say. "I'm the schoolteacher there." "A schoolteacher? Well, now that's impressive. What subjects do you teach?" Catherine tried to focus on the question, grateful for the distraction. "Everything. Reading, writing, arithmetic. History when I can manage it." "And what brings you out here all alone? Bit dangerous for a lady, especially one not familiar with the territory." Despite her condition, Catherine felt a flicker of indignation. "I'm quite capable, Mr. Vance, or I thought I was. I was on my way to Sacramento to visit my sister. She's expecting her first child." Thomas chuckled, the sound rumbling in his chest against her back. "I don't doubt your capabilities, Miss Turner, but even the most experienced riders know better than to travel these parts alone." Catherine might have argued further, but another wave of nausea hit her, stealing her breath. She groaned, leaning more heavily against him. "Almost there," he assured her, his voice dropping to a soothing tone. "Just a little further." True to his word, they soon arrived at a small campsite nestled in a grove of trees. A simple tent was set up near a fire pit, with various surveying tools and maps spread on a makeshift table nearby. Thomas dismounted first, then carefully helped Catherine down. Her legs buckled as soon as her feet touched the ground, but he caught her, sweeping her up into his arms once more. "Let's get you inside the tent," he said, carrying her as if she weighed nothing at all. Inside the tent was a bedroll, a few personal items, and a stack of books unexpected in a cowboy's camp, but Catherine was in no state to comment. Thomas laid her gently on the bedroll, then stepped back. "I'm going to take care of the horses and get a fire going," he said. "Then I'll check your leg again. You rest." Catherine nodded weakly, her eyelids already growing heavy. She heard him moving around outside, speaking softly to the horses, but couldn't summon the energy to stay awake. As darkness closed in around her, she had one last coherent thought. She had placed her life in the hands of a complete stranger. When Catherine next opened her eyes, night had fallen. The pain in her leg had dulled to a persistent throb, but her mouth was dry and her head pounded. She tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness forced her back down. "Easy there," came Thomas's voice from nearby. He appeared at the tent opening, ducking his head to enter. "How are you feeling?" "Terrible," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper, "but alive thanks to you." He moved to her side, placing a cool, damp cloth on her forehead. "The fever's set in. That's normal with a snake bite. The good news is you're conscious and coherent. That's a good sign." He helped her sit up slightly, propping her against his pack. "Try to drink some water." Catherine took the canteen he offered, sipping slowly. "How long was I asleep?" "A few hours. Sun's been down about an hour now." She glanced toward the tent opening. "I need to, that is." Understanding dawned on his face. "Oh, of course, let me help you outside." With as much dignity as the situation allowed, Thomas helped Catherine to a private spot a short distance from the camp. He respectfully turned his back, supporting her only when she called for his help to return to the tent. Back inside, he checked her wound, cleaning it gently with water from his canteen. The area around the bite was swollen and discolored, but it didn't appear to be getting worse. "The venom's working its way through your system," he explained. "You'll feel sick for a while, maybe a day or two. But I think you'll pull through." "How do you know so much about snake bites?" Catherine asked, wincing as he rewrapped the wound with a fresh bandage. Thomas's expression grew somber. "Lost a friend to one when I was younger. After that, I made sure to learn everything I could about them." He secured the bandage and sat back. "Are you hungry? I've got some stew warming by the fire." Catherine's stomach lurched at the thought of food, but she knew she needed to eat to keep her strength up. "I could try a little." Thomas nodded, disappearing from the tent only to return moments later with a tin cup of fragrant stew. The smell made her stomach growl despite her nausea. "It's not fancy, but it's hot," he said, handing her the cup. Catherine took a small spoonful, surprised by the rich flavor. "This is actually quite good." Thomas smiled, and for the first time, Catherine noticed how it transformed his face, softening the hard lines and making his blue eyes crinkle at the corners. "My mother taught me to cook, said no man should rely on a woman to feed him." "Your mother sounds like a wise woman." "She was," he said, his smile fading. "She passed a few years back." "I'm sorry," Catherine said softly. "My mother's gone as well. It's just my father, my sister, and me now." They fell into a companionable silence as Catherine ate what she could of the stew. When she finished, Thomas took the cup from her. "You should rest," he said, rising to his feet. "I'll sleep by the fire. Call if you need anything." "Wait," Catherine said, suddenly reluctant to be alone. The fever was making her feel strange, vulnerable in a way she wasn't accustomed to. Would you stay and talk a while longer, unless you're tired?" Thomas hesitated, then nodded, settling back down cross-legged near the bedroll. "What would you like to talk about?" Catherine thought for a moment. "Tell me how you became a surveyor for the railroad. It's not a common profession." Thomas chuckled. "No, I suppose not. I was always good with numbers and maps, even as a boy. After the war I fought for the Union. I couldn't see going back to farming like my pa. I wanted to see more of the country." He gestured to the maps visible through the tent opening. The railroad was expanding west, and they needed men who could read the land, figure out the best routes. "It sounds fascinating," Catherine said, genuinely interested despite her discomfort. "But lonely." Thomas shrugged. I've got my books and my thoughts for company, and the occasional snakebite victim," he added with a wink that made Catherine laugh, then wince as pain shot through her leg. "Sorry," he said quickly. "Shouldn't make you laugh in your condition." "No, it's all right," she assured him. "It's better than dwelling on the pain." She studied him curiously. "What do you read? I noticed your books." "Anything I can get my hands on, really. History, poetry, novels when I can find them." He looked almost embarrassed by the admission. "My father thought it was a waste of time, but my mother encouraged it. She was a teacher, like you." Catherine felt a connection forming between them, tenuous but real. This rugged cowboy surveyor with his gentle hands and love of books was not at all what she would have expected to find out here in the wilderness. They talked for another hour, until Catherine's eyelids grew heavy again. Thomas noticed her fatigue and rose to leave. "Rest now," he said softly. "I'll be just outside if you need me." As Catherine drifted off to sleep, she was vaguely aware of him tucking the blanket more securely around her, his calloused fingers brushing her arm with unexpected tenderness. The night passed in a fever dream of pain and disjointed images. Several times, Catherine woke to find Thomas beside her, offering water or adjusting the cool cloth on her forehead. His presence was reassuring, his voice a low, soothing rumble in the darkness. By morning, the worst had passed. Catherine woke to sunlight filtering through the canvas of the tent. She felt weak, but the nausea had subsided and her head was clearer. She pushed herself into a sitting position, surprised to find she could do so without too much dizziness. "Thomas," she called, her voice stronger than it had been the day before. He appeared at the tent entrance, a relieved smile spreading across his face when he saw her sitting up. "Good morning. You're looking better." "I feel better," she said, returning his smile. "Still weak, but not like I'm dying anymore." "That's good progress. Think you can manage some breakfast?" "I've got coffee brewing and some biscuits warming by the fire." At the mention of coffee, Catherine perked up. "Coffee sounds heavenly." Thomas helped her out of the tent, supporting her as she hobbled to a log by the fire. Her leg was stiff and sore, but she could put some weight on it now. The morning air was cool and fresh, the sky a clear, brilliant blue. Birds sang in the trees around the camp, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves. It was hard to believe that just yesterday, Catherine had been fighting for her life. Thomas handed her a tin cup of steaming coffee. She wrapped her hands around it gratefully, inhaling the rich aroma before taking a sip. "Oh, that's good," she sighed, feeling life return to her limbs with each swallow. "Secret's a pinch of salt in the grounds," Thomas said, handing her a warm biscuit. "Another trick my mother taught me." Catherine accepted the biscuit, surprised by how hungry she felt. She bit into it, finding it surprisingly light and fluffy. "Is there anything you can't do, Mr. Vance?" she teased. "You save lives, cook, read poetry." Thomas laughed, the sound warming Catherine more than the coffee. "Plenty, Miss Turner. Can't sing worth a damn, for one, and I've never had much luck with growing things. Every plant I've ever tried to tend has died a quick and merciful death." Catherine laughed, then grew serious. "I don't know how to thank you for what you've done. You saved my life." Thomas waved off her gratitude. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Catherine said firmly. "Not anyone would have known what to do. Not anyone would have taken care of a stranger the way you've cared for me." She met his gaze directly. "I owe you my life, Thomas Vance." Thomas looked away, seemingly uncomfortable with her earnestness. "Well, you're not out of the woods yet. Snakebite can leave you weak for days. You're welcome to stay here until you're strong enough to travel, but I expect your family will be worried about you." Catherine's hand flew to her mouth. "My sister, she'll be frantic when I don't arrive. Is there anyone who can get word to her? Anyone expecting you along the way?" Catherine shook her head, feeling foolish. "No, I told her I'd be there yesterday evening, and my father, he warned me not to travel alone." She sighed. "He'll never let me hear the end of this." Thomas studied her for a moment. "Well, we're not far from the trail to Sacramento. Once you're feeling stronger, I can take you there myself." He glanced at his surveying equipment. "I've nearly finished this section anyway. It's time I reported back." "You do that for me," Catherine asked, touched by his offer. Of course, he said simply. Can't very well save your life only to leave you stranded in the wilderness, can I? Catherine smiled, feeling a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the coffee or the morning sun. Thank you. They spent the day in the camp, with Catherine resting and regaining her strength while Thomas worked on his maps. He showed her what he was doing, explaining how he measured distances and elevations, how he noted the best routes for the railroad tracks to follow. Catherine was fascinated by his work and impressed by his knowledge. As the day wore on, they talked more about their lives. Catherine told him about growing up in Concord, about her father's hardware store and her decision to become a teacher despite the limited opportunities for women. I always wanted to do something meaningful, she explained as they sat by the fire that evening, sharing another meal of Thomas's surprisingly delicious stew. Teaching gives me that chance, to shape young minds, to open doors for them that might otherwise remain closed. Thomas nodded, his expression thoughtful. That's a noble calling. My mother felt the same way. She taught in a small school in Ohio before she married my father and moved to his farm in Illinois. And what about you? Catherine asked. Is surveying your calling? Thomas considered this, stirring the fire with a stick. I don't know if I'd call it a calling, but I like the work. I like being outdoors, seeing new places. And there's a satisfaction in knowing you're helping to build something that will connect people, make their lives easier. It must be lonely, though, Catherine observed. All those weeks out here by yourself. Thomas shrugged. Sometimes, but I've always been comfortable with my own company. He glanced at her, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Though I have to admit, it's been nice having someone to talk to these past couple of days. Catherine felt a blush creep into her cheeks. Even a half-dead schoolteacher who was foolish enough to get bitten by a snake, especially that kind, he teased, his eyes crinkling with amusement. Makes for a much more interesting conversation than talking to my horse. Catherine laughed, surprised by how at ease she felt with this man she'd known for such a short time. There was something about Thomas Vance that inspired trust, a steadiness that made her feel safe despite their unusual circumstances. As night fell, Thomas built up the fire and set up a second bedroll outside the tent. You should take the tent again, he said. I'll be fine out here. Catherine hesitated. I feel bad taking your shelter when you're the one who's been so kind. Nonsense, Thomas said firmly. You're still recovering. Besides, it's a warm night. I prefer sleeping under the stars when I can. Catherine couldn't argue with his logic, though part of her was reluctant to be apart from him even for the few hours of sleep. She'd grown accustomed to his presence, his quiet strength. If you're sure, she said finally, but tomorrow I should be strong enough to travel. I won't impose on your kindness any longer than necessary. Thomas helped her to the tent, his hand warm and steady on her elbow. At the entrance, she turned to face him, suddenly aware of how close they were standing. In the fading light, his eyes looked darker, his expression unreadable. Good night, Thomas, she said softly, and thank you again for everything, he nodded, stepping back. Good night, Catherine, rest well. Inside the tent, Catherine settled onto the bedroll, listening to the sounds of Thomas moving around the camp, banking the fire for the night. Despite her exhaustion, sleep eluded her. Her mind kept returning to the moment outside the tent, to the look in Thomas's eyes, to the strange connection she felt with this man she barely knew. It was foolish, she told herself. She was merely grateful to him for saving her life, confused by the vulnerability of her condition. Yet she couldn't deny there was something more, an attraction that went beyond gratitude. Thomas Vance was unlike any man she'd met in Concord. He was self-sufficient, educated in his own way, kind without expectation of reward. And she had to admit, he was handsome in a rugged, sun-weathered way that made her heart beat a little faster when he smiled. Eventually, lulled by the night sounds of the wilderness and the knowledge that Thomas was just outside, Catherine drifted off to sleep. She woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of movement around the camp. Pushing herself up, she was pleased to find that the weakness from the day before had largely subsided. Her leg was still sore, the area around the bite tender and discolored, but she could move it without too much pain. Catherine crawled out of the tent, blinking in the early morning light. Thomas was already up, tending to the horses and preparing breakfast. "Good morning," she called, making her way slowly to the fire. Thomas looked up, a smile spreading across his face when he saw her walking unaided. "Well, look at you, on your feet already." "I'm feeling much better," she said, lowering herself carefully onto a log. "Your care has worked wonders." Thomas handed her a cup of coffee. "Your body did most of the work. You're stronger than you look, Miss Turner." "I think after what we've been through, you can call me Catherine," she said, sipping the hot coffee gratefully. "Catherine," he repeated, the name sounding different in his deep voice. "And you should call me Thomas if you're comfortable with that." "I am," she said, meeting his eyes over the rim of her cup. "Very comfortable." A moment of silence stretched between them, charged with something neither of them was ready to name. Thomas was the first to break it, turning back to the fire where he was cooking a pan of beans and bacon. "If you're feeling up to it, we can head out after breakfast," he said. "It's about a day's ride to Sacramento from here, but we can take it slow. Stop if you need to rest." Catherine nodded, hiding her disappointment at the thought of their time together coming to an end. "That sounds sensible." "My sister will be worried sick." They ate breakfast, then set about breaking camp. Thomas efficiently packed up his surveying equipment and personal belongings, showing Catherine how he secured everything to his pack horse. She helped where she could, though her movements were still slower than usual. By mid-morning, they were ready to depart. Thomas had decided it would be safer for Catherine to ride with him on his stallion, rather than risk her becoming dizzy and falling from her own mare. He secured her horse to his pack horse's lead, then helped Catherine mount. "I'll get up behind you," he said, his hands strong and sure as he lifted her onto the saddle. Catherine settled herself, then felt the horse shift as Thomas swung up behind her. His chest pressed against her back, his arms encircling her to take the reins. It was an intimate position but necessary given her condition. Still, she couldn't help the flutter in her stomach at his closeness. "Comfortable?" he asked, his breath warm against her ear. "Yes," she managed to say, hoping he couldn't feel the way her heart had accelerated. They set off at a steady pace, following a trail that wound through the hills toward the more traveled route to Sacramento. The day was pleasant, with a light breeze tempering the heat of the sun. Birds called from the trees, and occasionally they spotted deer or rabbits moving through the underbrush. As they rode, they continued the conversation they'd begun at the camp, sharing stories of their lives and discovering mutual interests. Thomas had a dry wit that made Catherine laugh, and a depth of knowledge about the natural world that she found fascinating. "How do you know all this?" she asked after he'd identified a dozen different plants and explained their uses. "Books mostly," he replied. "And listening to the old-timers when I first started surveying. They know things you'll never find written down anywhere." They stopped at midday to rest and water the horses. Thomas helped Catherine down, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than strictly necessary. He spread a blanket in the shade of a large oak and they sat together, sharing a simple meal of jerky, dried fruit, and the last of the biscuits. "May I ask you something personal?" Catherine ventured as they ate. Thomas nodded, curious. "Of course." "Why aren't you married?" "A man like you, kind, capable, educated in your way." She felt her cheeks warm but pressed on. "It seems you would have no shortage of interested women." Thomas looked surprised by the question, then thoughtful. "I suppose my lifestyle doesn't lend itself to settling down. I'm on the road more than I'm in any one place." He paused, picking up a twig and breaking it between his fingers. "And to be honest, I've never met a woman who made me want to change that." Until he stopped abruptly, his eyes meeting hers for a brief, charged moment before he looked away. Catherine's heart skipped a beat. "Until," she prompted softly. Thomas shook his head, standing up and brushing off his pants. "We should get going if we want to reach Sacramento by nightfall." Catherine wanted to press him, to make him finish what he'd been about to say, but something in his manner stopped her. Instead, she allowed him to help her to her feet, trying to ignore the disappointment that welled up inside her. They rode in silence for a while, both lost in their own thoughts. The trail began to widen, showing signs of more frequent travel. They passed a few wagons and riders heading in the opposite direction, each time exchanging brief greetings. As the afternoon wore on, Catherine found herself growing tired, the exertion of the day taking its toll on her still recovering body. She tried to hide it, sitting up straighter in the saddle, but Thomas noticed. "You're exhausted," he said, concern evident in his voice. "We should stop and rest." "No, I'm fine," Catherine insisted. "I want to reach Sacramento today. My sister will still be there if we arrive tomorrow morning," Thomas finished for her. "There's a small settlement not far ahead. We can find a room for the night, let you rest properly." Catherine wanted to argue, but the truth was, she wasn't sure she could stay upright in the saddle much longer. Her leg was throbbing and a bone-deep weariness had settled over her. "All right," she conceded, "but just for tonight." Thomas nodded, guiding his horse toward the settlement, which was visible now as a collection of buildings in the distance. As they drew closer, Catherine could make out a general store, a blacksmith shop, a small church, and what appeared to be a boarding house. They rode directly to the boarding house, a two-story wooden structure with a wide porch. Thomas dismounted first, then helped Catherine down, supporting her when her legs threatened to buckle. "Lean on me," he said, his arm strong around her waist. Inside, they found the proprietress, a plump, middle-aged woman named Mrs. Abernathy, who looked them over with curious eyes. "We need 2 rooms for the night," Thomas explained. "My friend was bitten by a rattlesnake 2 days ago. She's recovering but needs rest." Mrs. Abernathy's expression changed to one of concern. "Oh, you poor dear, nasty things, rattlers." She consulted her ledger. "I'm afraid I've only got 1 room available at present. Some travelers came through this morning and took the others." Thomas and Catherine exchanged a glance, both aware of the impropriety of sharing a room even under these circumstances. "I can sleep in the stable," Thomas offered, "if you'll just let Miss Turner have the room." "Nonsense," Mrs. Abernathy said firmly. "The room has 2 beds." "Perfectly respectable. And with her condition, someone should be nearby in case she needs help in the night." She lowered her voice. "Besides, it's clear to anyone with eyes that you've been taking good care of her. I'm not about to stand on ceremony when a life's at stake." Catherine felt a rush of gratitude toward the practical woman. "Thank you, Mrs. Abernathy, we accept." Thomas still looked uncomfortable but nodded his agreement. Mrs. Abernathy beamed at them, then bustled off to prepare their room. "I can find somewhere else to sleep," Thomas said quietly once they were alone in the small sitting room. "It's not proper, Thomas," Catherine interrupted, placing her hand on his arm. "Mrs. Abernathy is right. It's a perfectly respectable arrangement, and I would feel safer with you nearby." The admission cost her something in pride, but it was the truth. The thought of being alone, still weak from the snakebite, in a strange place was unsettling. Thomas studied her face for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, but only because you're still recovering." Mrs. Abernathy returned to show them to their room, a simple but clean space with 2 narrow beds, a washstand, and a small window overlooking the main street. She provided them with fresh towels and promised to send up some dinner shortly. Left alone, Catherine sank gratefully onto one of the beds, while Thomas stood awkwardly by the door. The intimacy of the shared space seemed to hang between them, making both hyper-aware of the other's presence. "I should see to the horses," Thomas said finally, breaking the silence. "Will you be all right for a few minutes?" Catherine nodded, relieved to have a moment alone to collect herself. "Yes, of course. Take your time." After Thomas left, Catherine used the pitcher of water on the washstand to freshen up as best she could. She removed her boots and stockings to examine her leg. The bite area was still swollen and discolored, but the intense heat had subsided and the edges of the wound looked clean. Thomas's quick action had likely saved her from a much worse outcome. She had just finished rewrapping the bandage when there was a knock at the door. It was Mrs. Abernathy's young daughter, bringing a tray with their dinner, a hearty stew, fresh bread, and 2 slices of apple pie. Catherine thanked her, setting the tray on the small table between the beds. The smell of the food made her realize how hungry she was. Despite her fatigue, she found herself looking forward to sharing this meal with Thomas, to continuing their conversation from earlier. Thomas returned just as Catherine was wondering if she should wait for him or begin eating. He'd clearly taken the opportunity to wash up as well. His face was clean, his hair damp at the edges, and he'd changed into a fresh shirt. "Mrs. Abernathy sent dinner," Catherine said, gesturing to the tray. Thomas nodded, moving to sit on the edge of his bed facing her. "It smells good." "You should eat while it's hot." They ate in companionable silence for a while, both savoring the simple but delicious food. As they finished, Thomas set aside his empty plate and looked at Catherine thoughtfully. "How's your leg feeling now?" "Better," she said. "Still sore, but the swelling seems to be going down." "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward her leg. Catherine nodded, extending her leg slightly. Thomas moved to kneel beside her bed, his hands gentle as he examined the bandage. "I should change this before you sleep," he said. "Do you mind?" "No," Catherine replied, her voice softer than she intended. Thomas retrieved his saddlebag, which he'd brought up to the room, and pulled out a clean bandana. With practiced efficiency, he unwrapped the old bandage, cleaned the wound with a little water, and applied the fresh wrap. Catherine watched his face as he worked, struck by the concentration in his expression, the care in his touch. His hands were strong and calloused from work, yet so gentle on her skin. She felt a now familiar flutter in her stomach, a warmth that had nothing to do with her healing wound. When he finished, Thomas's eyes met hers, and for a moment neither spoke. Catherine could see something in his gaze, a question, perhaps, or a recognition of the same unnamed feeling she was experiencing. "Thomas," she began, not entirely sure what she wanted to say. But before she could continue, he stood up, breaking the moment. "You should rest," he said, his voice slightly rough. "It's been a long day." Catherine wanted to protest, to ask him to stay beside her a little longer, but she knew he was right. She was exhausted, and tomorrow would bring its own challenges. "Yes," she agreed reluctantly. "I suppose I should." Thomas turned his back while she prepared for bed, removing only her outer clothing and slipping under the covers in her chemise and petticoat. When she was settled, he blew out all but one candle, then removed his boots and outer shirt before lying down on his own bed. In the dim light, Catherine could just make out his profile as he stared at the ceiling. She wanted to reach across the space between their beds to bridge the physical and emotional gap that separated them. Instead, she whispered, "Good night, Thomas." He turned his head toward her, his expression softening in the candlelight. "Good night, Catherine, sleep well." Catherine closed her eyes, but sleep did not come immediately. Her mind was too full of the day's events, of Thomas's nearness, of the connection that seemed to be growing between them despite the brevity of their acquaintance. It was foolish, she told herself again. In another day they would reach Sacramento, and she would reunite with her sister. Thomas would continue on his way, back to his solitary life of surveying. Their paths, which had crossed so unexpectedly, would diverge once more. The thought brought an unexpected ache to her chest. In just 2 days, Thomas Vance had become important to her in a way she couldn't fully explain. It wasn't just gratitude for saving her life, though that was certainly part of it. It was something more, a recognition of a kindred spirit, perhaps, or the beginning of a deeper feeling that she was afraid to name. Eventually, exhaustion claimed her, and Catherine drifted into a deep, dreamless sleep. She woke to early morning light filtering through the window and the sound of Thomas moving quietly around the room. He was already dressed, his saddlebag packed beside the door. "Good morning," she said, her voice still husky with sleep. Thomas turned, a small smile softening his features when he saw she was awake. "Good morning. How did you sleep?" Better than I have in days, Catherine admitted, sitting up and running a hand through her tangled hair. What time is it? Just past dawn. I thought we could get an early start, but there's no rush if you need more rest. Catherine shook her head, pushing back the covers. No, early is good. The sooner we reach Sacramento, the sooner my sister can stop worrying. She gathered her things and excused herself to use the washroom down the hall. When she returned, dressed and with her hair neatly pinned up, Thomas was waiting with a tray of breakfast that Mrs. Abernathy had sent up. "You look much better today," he observed as they ate. "Some color back in your cheeks." "I feel better," Catherine said. "Still a bit weak, but nothing like yesterday. I think I could ride on my own today." Thomas shook his head. "Let's not push it. It's only a few more hours to Sacramento, better safe than sorry." Catherine wanted to argue but knew he was right. Instead, she changed the subject. "Tell me more about your work for the railroad. Where do you go next after Sacramento?" Thomas hesitated, setting down his coffee cup. "Actually, I've been thinking about that. My contract with the railroad is nearly up. I was planning to renew it, but lately I've been wondering if it might be time for a change." "What kind of change?" Catherine asked, curious about this shift in his plans. "I'm not entirely sure yet, but I've been on the road for 4 years now. Maybe it's time to put down some roots somewhere." His eyes met hers briefly before looking away. "Or at least consider the possibility." Catherine felt her heart beat faster at the implication in his words, but she was afraid to read too much into them. "Well, I suppose everyone needs a home base of some kind, even if they still travel for work." "Yes," Thomas agreed, his expression thoughtful. "A place to return to, people to return to." They finished their breakfast in a companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts, after paying Mrs. Abernathy and thanking her for her hospitality. They set out on the final leg of their journey to Sacramento. As before, Catherine rode with Thomas, his arms around her as he guided the horse. But today, she was more aware of his closeness, of the strength of his chest against her back, the warmth of his breath occasionally tickling her neck when he leaned forward to speak. The landscape gradually changed as they drew closer to Sacramento. The isolated hills gave way to more settled areas, with farms and orchards appearing with increasing frequency. They passed more travelers on the road, most offering friendly nods or greetings. By midday, they could see the city in the distance, its buildings rising along the banks of the river. Catherine felt a mix of emotions: relief at the thought of seeing her sister after the ordeal she'd been through, but also a growing sadness at the knowledge that her time with Thomas was drawing to a close. "My sister lives on the eastern edge of the city," she said as they approached the outskirts. "On Oak Street, near the church." Thomas nodded, guiding his horse in that direction. As they rode through the streets of Sacramento, Catherine was struck by how normal everything seemed: people going about their business, children playing, life continuing as it always had, while she felt irrevocably changed by her experience in the wilderness. When they reached Oak Street, Catherine pointed out her sister's house, a neat, 2-story structure with a small garden in front. Even from a distance, she could see her sister on the porch, pacing back and forth with a worried expression. "Eleanor," Catherine called, waving her arm. Her sister looked up, her face transforming with relief and joy. "Catherine?" "Oh, thank God." Thomas brought the horse to a stop in front of the house and helped Catherine dismount. Her legs were steadier today, but he kept a supportive hand at her elbow as Eleanor rushed down the path to meet them. "Catherine, we've been frantic with worry," Eleanor exclaimed, embracing her sister tightly. "When you didn't arrive, Father was ready to send out a search party. I convinced him to wait one more day before raising the alarm." "I'm so sorry to have worried you," Catherine said, returning her sister's embrace. "I had a bit of an accident on the way." Eleanor pulled back to look at her sister more carefully, noticing her pallor and the way she leaned slightly on the tall man beside her. "What happened, and who is this?" "This is Thomas Vance," Catherine said, turning to include him in the conversation. "He saved my life, Eleanor. I was bitten by a rattlesnake 2 days ago, miles from any town, if Thomas hadn't found me and known what to do." Eleanor's eyes widened with horror, then filled with tears. "A rattlesnake, oh, Catherine," she turned to Thomas, grasping his hand in both of hers. "Mr. Vance, I can't thank you enough for saving my sister." Thomas looked uncomfortable with the gratitude. "It was fortunate I was nearby," he said simply. "Anyone would have done the same." "No, they wouldn't have," Eleanor insisted. "Not everyone would know how to treat a snake bite or care for her afterward." She looked between Catherine and Thomas, noting something in their expressions. "Please, you must come in, both of you. You've had a long journey." Catherine expected Thomas to make his excuses, to say he needed to be on his way. To her surprise, he nodded, his eyes meeting hers briefly with an unspoken question. She smiled, hoping he could read her desire for him to stay a little longer. Inside, Eleanor insisted on examining Catherine's leg herself, exclaiming over the angry red marks that were still visible despite the healing that had begun. Her husband, James, arrived home shortly after, adding his own thanks to Thomas for saving his sister-in-law. "You must stay for dinner at the very least," Eleanor insisted when Thomas mentioned finding a hotel for the night. "It's the least we can do after what you've done for Catherine." Thomas hesitated, looking to Catherine for guidance. She nodded, hoping her expression conveyed her own wish for him to stay. "Please, Thomas, one more meal together." Something passed between them in that moment, an acknowledgement of the bond that had formed during their brief but intense time together, a reluctance to see it end so abruptly. "All right," Thomas agreed. "Thank you for your hospitality." Dinner was a lively affair, with Eleanor and James eager to hear the full story of Catherine's mishap and rescue. Thomas, who had been so comfortable talking with Catherine alone, was more reserved in the larger company, speaking only when directly addressed. But Catherine noticed the way his eyes often sought hers across the table, the small smile that played at the corners of his mouth when their gazes met. After dinner, Eleanor insisted that Thomas stay in their guest room rather than seek lodging elsewhere. "It's already getting dark, and all the decent hotels will be full at this hour," she argued. "Besides, I think Catherine would rest easier knowing you're nearby after all you've been through together." Catherine blushed at her sister's perception, but didn't contradict her. The truth was, she wasn't ready to say goodbye to Thomas, to lose the comfort of his presence so soon after finding it. Later, when the household had retired for the night, Catherine found herself unable to sleep. Her mind was too full of thoughts of Thomas, of the connection they'd formed, of the uncertain future that lay ahead. On an impulse, she rose from her bed, wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, and made her way downstairs to the porch. To her surprise, Thomas was already there, sitting on the steps and gazing up at the stars. He turned at the sound of her approach, his face softening when he saw her. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked as she settled beside him on the step. "No," she admitted. "Too much on my mind." Thomas nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Same here." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, the night air cool around them, the sounds of the city muted at this late hour. "Thomas," Catherine began, gathering her courage, "what happens tomorrow?" He sighed, his gaze returning to the stars. "I report to the railroad office, turn in my surveys after that." He shrugged. "I'm not sure anymore." "You said earlier that you were thinking of making a change," Catherine reminded him. "Have you decided what that might be?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was low and serious. "Catherine, I've spent the last 4 years of my life alone, moving from one place to the next, never staying long enough to form any real connections. It suited me, or I thought it did. But these past few days with you," he turned to look at her directly, "they've made me question everything." Catherine's heart raced at his words. "What do you mean?" "I mean that I've never met anyone like you. Someone who can make me laugh, who challenges my thinking, who makes me want to be better than I am." He reached out, hesitantly taking her hand in his. "Someone who makes me think that maybe there's more to life than work and solitude." Catherine looked down at their joined hands, then back up at his face, illuminated by the soft glow of moonlight. "I feel it too," she whispered. "This connection between us. It doesn't make any sense we've known each other such a short time, but it feels real," Thomas finished for her. "More real than anything I've felt in a long time." "Yes," Catherine agreed, squeezing his hand. "But what does it mean? Where do we go from here?" Thomas took a deep breath, as if gathering his courage. "I'd like to find out if you're willing. I'm not asking for any promises, it's too soon for that. But maybe I could stay in Sacramento for a while, or visit Concord when you return home. We could see if this connection is as strong as it feels right now." Catherine felt a surge of hope in her chest. "I'd like that, Thomas." "Very much." He smiled then, a full, genuine smile that transformed his face and made Catherine's breath catch. Slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, he leaned forward until their foreheads were touching. "May I kiss you, Catherine Turner?" he whispered. In answer, she closed the remaining distance between them, pressing her lips to his in a soft, sweet kiss. His hand came up to cup her cheek, his touch gentle as their lips moved together in a tentative exploration. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Thomas kept his hand on her face, his thumb caressing her cheekbone. "I never expected to find you out there in the wilderness," he said softly, "but I'm incredibly grateful that I did." "Even though I was a half-dead schoolteacher with a snake bite," Catherine teased, echoing her words from days before. Thomas laughed, the sound warm in the night air. "Especially then. You were the bravest, most determined half-dead schoolteacher I'd ever seen." They stayed on the porch for another hour, talking softly about possibilities, about hopes, about the strange twist of fate that had brought them together. When the night air grew too cool, they reluctantly returned to their separate rooms, each carrying a new warmth in their hearts. The next morning, Thomas went to the railroad office to deliver his surveys, while Catherine spent time with her sister, finally meeting her new niece or nephew who was still months from being born. Eleanor, perceptive as always, noticed the change in her sister's demeanor. "There's something between you and Mr. Vance, isn't there?" she asked as they sat in the garden shelling peas for dinner. Catherine couldn't hide her smile. "Yes, it's new and unexpected, but yes." Eleanor studied her sister's face, then nodded approvingly. "I thought so. The way you look at each other, it reminds me of how James and I were in the beginning." She took Catherine's hand. "He seems like a good man." "He is," Catherine said simply, "the best I've ever known." "Then I'm happy for you, even if it did take a rattlesnake to bring you together," Eleanor teased. When Thomas returned that afternoon, he had news. "The railroads offered me a new position," he explained as they walked together in the garden. "Supervising the construction phase of the line I've been surveying. It would mean staying in one place for a while right here in Sacramento." Catherine couldn't hide her delight. "Thomas, that's wonderful. Did you accept?" He nodded, his eyes bright with excitement. "I did. It's a chance to see the work through to completion, to build something lasting." He took her hands in his. "And it means I can be near you at least until you return to Concord." "About that," Catherine said, feeling suddenly nervous, "I've been thinking. The school year in Concord doesn't start for another 2 months. I could stay with Eleanor a while longer, perhaps even look for a teaching position here in Sacramento." Thomas's face lit up with hope. "You'd consider staying?" "I would," Catherine said, "for the right reason." He drew her closer, his arms encircling her waist. "And am I the right reason, Miss Turner?" Catherine smiled up at him, her heart full. "You're getting there, Mr. Vance." Their lips met in another kiss, deeper and more confident than the one they'd shared the night before. It was a promise of things to come, of a future neither had anticipated but both now embraced. Over the next 2 months, Catherine and Thomas grew closer, spending every free moment together. Thomas threw himself into his new role with the railroad, earning the respect of the construction crews with his fair-minded leadership and thorough knowledge of the terrain. Catherine, with Eleanor's help, secured a position at a local school for the fall term, deciding to remain in Sacramento at least through the next year. Their courtship was unconventional by most standards, born of danger and necessity, developed over candle-lit conversations and long walks along the river. But neither Catherine nor Thomas cared much for convention. They had found something rare and precious in each other, a connection that defied easy explanation but felt undeniably right. On the 2-month anniversary of the day Thomas had found Catherine in the wilderness, he took her back to the spot where they'd first met. It was a long ride, but worth it to revisit the place where their story had begun. Standing beneath the same trees where Catherine had been bitten, Thomas took her hands in his. "It's strange to think that if you hadn't taken that shortcut, if you hadn't been bitten by that snake, if I hadn't happened to be surveying that particular area on that particular day," he mused. "We might never have met," Catherine finished for him. "It's a frightening thought." "It makes me believe in fate," Thomas said, his expression serious. "That some things are meant to be, no matter how unlikely they seem." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. Catherine's breath caught in her throat as he dropped to one knee before her. "Catherine Turner, I know it's only been 2 months since a rattlesnake brought us together. But in that time, I've come to know with absolute certainty that you are the woman I want to spend my life with." He opened the box, revealing a simple gold ring with a small sapphire. "Will you marry me?" Tears filled Catherine's eyes as she looked down at the man who had saved her life and then, day by day, captured her heart. "Yes, Thomas, yes, I will marry you." His hands trembled slightly as he slipped the ring onto her finger, then stood to gather her in his arms. Their kiss was tender and passionate, a seal on the promise they had just made to each other. "I love you, Catherine," Thomas whispered against her lips, "more than I ever thought possible." "And I love you," she replied, her heart so full she thought it might burst. "My rattlesnake hero." They were married 3 months later in a small ceremony in Aliner's garden. Catherine's father traveled from Concord for the occasion, initially skeptical of the whirlwind romance but won over by Thomas's obvious devotion to his daughter. The couple honeymooned in San Francisco, staying in a small hotel overlooking the bay. As they settled into married life in Sacramento, Catherine continuing to teach, while Thomas supervised the railroad construction, they often marveled at the strange twist of fate that had brought them together. The scar on Catherine's leg remained, a permanent reminder of the day that had changed both their lives forever. 5 years later, Thomas and Catherine Vance stood on the porch of their own home on the outskirts of Sacramento, watching their 3-year-old son, William, play in the yard with their loyal dog, Scout. Catherine's hand rested on her swollen belly, where their second child, the doctor suspected another boy, was due in just 2 months. "No regrets?" Thomas asked, his arm around his wife's shoulders as they watched their son's antics. Catherine looked up at the man who had sucked the venom from her leg and stayed until morning, the man who had chosen to stay for a lifetime. "Not a single one," she said, rising on tiptoe to kiss him. "Though I do think we should teach William about snakes sooner rather than later." Thomas laughed, pulling her closer. "Agreed. No son of ours is going to be caught unprepared in the wilderness." As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over their home and family, Catherine reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. A reckless shortcut, a venomous bite, a chance encounter with a man who knew exactly what to do. These were the unlikely building blocks of the life they had created together. A life neither of them had been looking for, but one they now couldn't imagine living without. In the distance, they could hear the whistle of a train, one of the very trains that now ran on the tracks Thomas had helped to lay. It was a sound that always made them smile, a reminder of the work that had first brought Thomas to that fateful spot in the wilderness. "I love you, Thomas Vance," Catherine said softly, leaning into his embrace. "And I love you, Catherine Vance," he replied, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Always will." As darkness fell, they called William in for supper, the 3 of them, soon to be 4, gathering around the table in the warm light of their home. Outside, the stars appeared one by one in the vast California sky, shining down on the family that had been born from danger and saved by love. A love that had begun with a rattlesnake bite miles from town, a cowboy who sucked the venom, and the morning that had changed everything.